Hello, chefs. This is Chef's PSA Podcast. I'm your host, André Natera. On today's episode, we're going to talk about universal laws through a chef's lens. Stay tuned. Now, before we get started, here's a brief update. I just completed my new book, Bad Cooks Everywhere. It's going to be out June 8th on paperback. So if you want it, which I know you want it, go get it. It's good. It's fiction. For those of you that are unaware, you haven't been following along. It's a fictional narrative about a culinary school student going into kitchens and what that is like. I mean, it's not a true story, but it's your true story. It's every chef's true story. All the characters in there are going to remind you of someone. Maybe you, maybe your boss, maybe your friend. Anyway, you get the point. You want to go get it. Bad Cooks Everywhere. Out June 8th. It's going to be available on Amazon. Now, for those of you that are premium subscribers to my Substack, you get early access to the ebook before anyone else. So if you're a premium subscriber on my Substack, which I'll link in the show notes, you could go subscribe now and get access to the book now. So some incentive there. There's also a few podcast episodes that are exclusive to my Substack premium subscribers, as well as other free ebooks and classes and things like that. So it's definitely worth it for $10 a month. I would pay $10 a month. I'd probably pay more, but it's only $10 a month. Anyway, we digress. If you want to support the show, you know what to do. If you listen on Spotify, make sure you leave 5 stars, nothing less than 5 stars. It's a 5-star podcast. If you're watching on YouTube, hit the like and subscribe button. I appreciate it. For those of you that are following along, this is the new format. We're going to go one solo episode, one guest-centric episode. So this is my solo episode with you. And today's episode is about universal laws. So what are universal laws? Universal laws are typically laws that are inherently true. They're not always true. There's always an exception to the rule. And these universal laws are acceptable across multiple situations. In this case, we're taking some of the most common universal laws, maybe you'll learn something, and how do they apply to a culinary or leadership setting in the kitchen. You could think of this podcast as a companion episode to another podcast that I did earlier called The Mental Blocks. The Mental Blocks, which is Chef's PSA episode 26. So think of this as a companion to that. You should go back and listen to that one if you enjoy this one. We're going to take some of these universal laws and we're going to apply them to what you're doing, and we're going to learn. We're going to learn how to think strategically. This is the advantage that you get from listening to Chef's PSA, is that I'm always thinking how you can be the exception to the rule. And one of the biggest things that I noticed in a lot of successful chefs, as well as myself in my career, is that the chefs that think differently are usually the ones that are the most successful. When you think like everyone else, you end up like everyone else. And what are those little things that give a slight advantage to other chefs? It's usually in how they think and how they approach situations. And I'm not just talking about food. Sometimes I'm talking about management, leadership, marketing, all the things that go into being a chef. They all play a part in making sure that you're successful. So today, let's start with the very first law that we're going to explain, Murphy's Law. Everyone knows Murphy's Law. Anything that can go wrong will go wrong. How does that apply to the kitchen? Well, as a chef, you have to constantly be thinking about what can go wrong in every potential situation. If you're doing a catering, did you count all the plates? Did you count all the gloves? Did you count all the proteins? Did you schedule enough people? Did you anticipate that this person may call off? You always have to have a backup plan. I was talking to a friend the other day and I told him to make sure that he had his bases covered for a certain situation. And he said, I'm pretty sure that situation won't happen. I said, well, cover your bases anyway, because you don't want to be in a situation where it does happen and then you think, oh, I should have spent 5 minutes planning, right? That's something that a lot of chefs do, is we think everything's going to go well, so we don't think about all the things that could potentially go wrong. When I was a chef, I used to sit all my chefs in the room with me and I would think about every possible scenario from every potential angle. I would go through everything in my mind and I would think of what could go wrong in this situation. Where are my blind spots? And as my other chefs would come into the office, we'd sit around and say, did you think of this? Did you think of that? What if this? What if that? And it's like looking at the chessboard. You want to make sure that you think of all the potential moves and what could be the potential outcome of those moves. Sometimes the move looks good and then you do it and the outcome is bad. So thinking about every possible outcome with Murphy's Law, in this case, you want to make sure that you have a mitigation plan for whatever could potentially happen. The next one is Parkinson's Law. Work expands to fill the time available for completion. What does that mean? It means that however long you give someone to do something is how long it's going to take them to do it. Putting timelines on things will help you become more efficient. So I'm going to give you an example. If you write a prep list that has 20 items on it and someone has 8 hours to do that prep list, they'll get it done. If you write a prep list with half of the amount and they have 8 hours to do it, they'll still get it done in 8 hours. It's a really amazing thing. For those of you that use lists and to-do lists, it's amazing when you write everything on your to-do list, how you could accomplish it, whether that's one thing or 20 things. It always manages to get done. If you go back and you listen to the last episode I did with Aaron Bludorn, we were talking about how when he was on the chef's table, how he only had an hour to get the food up. And it was a lot of food to prepare in 1 hour. And I asked him the question, I said, were you ever surprised at how much you were able to do in 1 hour? And he says, yeah, it blew my mind, which was reinforcing the idea of how people underestimate how much work they could do in an allotted time frame that they're working with. So that's Parkinson's law. Time management skills, putting deadlines on things. When I was a chef, I used to write prep lists for people that were just a little bit more than I knew they could handle, and they always got it done. If you want to improve your speed in your kitchen, write longer prep lists. If you're a cook and you want to improve your own speed, give yourself a longer prep list and see how much more you can accomplish, because for some reason, it always gets done. The next universal law that we're going to talk about is the Pareto principle, otherwise known as the 80-20 rule. And what that means is usually 80% of the outcomes are affected by 20% of the input, or 20% of the cause. And you think about that as a chef, about 80% of the work gets done by 20% of the employees, or 80% of the revenue comes from about 20% of the menu items. So a lot of times when I would go in and someone wanted me to improve the menu, I would focus on the workhorses of the menu and say, if we're getting bad scores, from Yelp or OpenTable or comments, you don't need to focus on everything on the menu. Focus on the items that are selling, because that's what's causing the most amount of feedback. The 20% is usually affecting the 80%. So focus on the most important 20%, and you'll make big impact on the other 80%. Your food cost might be driven by 20% of the items that you're buying, not the other 80%. Sometimes if you're an executive chef and you're tasked with lowering food cost, and you pull up a spreadsheet with all the items that you're buying and you start looking at everything, the bottom items, the salt, and how much you're spending on bread and how much you're spending on this, that, and the other, when if you just look at the top 20% of the items, that's where you're going to make the biggest amount of impact. So don't worry about the bottom 80%, focus on the top 20%. Pareto principle, 80-20 rule. The next one is the Peter principle. Specifically in a hierarchy situation, employees tend to rise to the level of incompetence. And what that means is that people usually get promoted to the point where they become incompetent. Then they stop getting promoted. So sometimes you get stuck in a position and you don't move further up. And it's usually because you've been promoted quickly to the point where you may have skipped over some things. There may have been some learning opportunities that you missed. And then you reach that position and then you're stagnant for many years until a new injection of growth and learning comes in. And this is a dangerous situation for a lot of chefs, because I notice a lot of times we're really eager to get to the position and to the title. So maybe you want to get to the executive chef or the sous chef position. And so you take the job that's going to give you the title, but you don't grow as much there. And so you remain stagnant. Or you get promoted too quick and you weren't fully prepared to go into that job. So you're stagnant while you're learning the job while you're in it. And you may be stuck there for quite some time. And a lot of times people that may be promoted beyond their capabilities, it leads to inefficiencies in the kitchen, into the operation. They start causing more problems because they don't fully know what they're doing. They haven't fully grown in the position. So how do you correct that? One is to make sure that you're very honest with yourself, that you have a solid training plan in place for the people that you're promoting, to make sure that you're not putting someone in a position before they're ready, that you have continuing education opportunities for people to learn. If it's self-driven learning, make sure that you as the chef are using all the resources available to you, social media, YouTube, so on and so forth, this podcast, other podcasts that are not as good as this one, but this one's pretty good. Anyway, we digress. You get the point. Peter principle. The next one is the law of diminishing returns. Now, Thomas Keller talks about this in his French Laundry cookbook, where he talks about the portion size and that just making something bigger, after several bites, diminishing returns on the flavor. But there's also diminishing returns in other aspects of the kitchen. There's diminishing returns when you put too many cooks on the line. They start bumping into each other. So let's just say you have a full rail on the board and you have 3 cooks on the line. 4 would make it better. 5 might make it worse. 6 will make it even worse. So there's diminishing returns by adding more people to assist. They start getting in each other's way. Diminishing returns by adding more cooks to the situation. Diminishing returns when you're creating a dish. Putting more doesn't necessarily make it better. And as chefs, we fall into this category a lot. You think, oh, it just needs one more thing. Let's put one more garnish. Let's put one more step. And you keep adding to a specific dish, but but the more you add, you actually subtract from the overall dish. Less is more sometimes. That's the law of diminishing returns. It applies in many different aspects of the kitchen. The next one is Gilbert's law. Every solution leads to a new problem. In a kitchen, if you're in a leadership position, you start solving problems constantly. You become a problem solver. Whack-a-mole management, as they say. One thing pops up, you knock it down, you go to the next. But what you start to discover is sometimes when you solve problems, this is especially true when you take over a new place, is that you think you see the problem and you've solved it, only to discover that that problem was created by 3 other problems. So you solve those 3 problems, only to find out that there was 8 more problems creating the 3. And the further down you go, the more problems you find. The more you dig, the more you get. So when you're placed in a position of leadership, you have to understand that what you see on the surface is just that. It's just the surface level problems. They're typically being created by many layers below that. So I often tell chefs that work for me this is when you start digging for problems, you got to be prepared for whatever else you're going to uncover, right? You might start digging and you might find a graveyard of skeletons. So be prepared. When you start solving problems, there's going to be more problems that you find when you start solving them. The next one is Wilson's Law. And Wilson's Law is basically when you find a solution that works, someone wants to change it. This one's so true in kitchens, right? The system works, everything's running smooth. New manager comes in, new chef, new sous chef, new GM, whatever, new ownership. And they're like, this is not working, let's change it. I liked it better at my other place. And they throw a monkey wrench in the system and it causes chaos. And it doesn't necessarily work better. It actually creates more work and more dysfunction. That old expression, that's not how we did it at my last job, can sometimes be the catalyst for invoking Wilson's Law. You quickly want to implement change to the system that's already working and functioning. And then you start to realize later on that maybe just because it worked at the last place doesn't mean it works at this place. I was talking with the chef about this the other day, is the way I cook in one kitchen isn't necessarily the same way I would cook in another kitchen. Because your skill level adapts to the circumstances. You have a kitchen with all the toys and all the gadgets and everything functioning and a high functioning team, you could cook at a pretty high level. You go into another kitchen where the stove is broken and the walk-in doesn't work and you didn't get a delivery and you're working with entry-level cooks in a very busy restaurant, your style of food is going to change. It's not a cookbook answer. Not everything works universally across kitchens. I would advise that you have some sort of negotiation process or some sort of vetting process before you implement change. My advice to new executive chefs typically when they take over a place is you have 30 days, don't change anything, write everything down so you don't forget, because after some time it becomes wallpaper. But if you write down what you want to change and you don't change it, you could go back and slowly, strategically start implementing that change. After 30 days, you usually understand the system. And then you might go back and look at your list and say, thank God I didn't change that. Now I understand why that is the way it is. Because a lot of times we're quick to want to implement change because we think we have a better solution, but we don't fully understand the problem. The last one is Falkland's Law. When it's not necessary to change, it's necessary to not change. Constant change can be disruptive. It makes people want to quit. Usually that's why there's high turnover when there's transition in leadership or there's transition in staff, because the amount of change that's going on, you're getting new leaders. Those new leaders are bringing in new systems. Everyone has new ideas. And this kind of ties into the last law that we talked about, is sometimes you don't need to change it. You don't need to change it just for the sake of changing it. Because for the team around you, they need to get rhythm and repetition in what they're currently doing. And constantly introducing chaos leads to things not being consistent. It leads to frustration. It leads to mistakes. Yes, it does lead to growth because you're learning new things, but change for the sake of change alone sometimes isn't a smart decision. You have to be strategic. Think things through before you implement change. Sometimes stability is good. When I usually take over an operation, like I said, the first 30 days I understand. I write everything down. And then as I start implementing change, I want to do so rapidly, make sure it sticks to the point where we get to stability. And then once stability is established, then I want to minimize the amount of changes in the kitchen. We have discussions before we change anything, because I'm not saying that I have all the right ideas, but what I am saying is before we change the idea, we need to make sure that everyone understands, everyone's on board, and it's not changed just for the sake of change. It causes dissension, it causes confusion, and in the end, it's going to cause more work for you. Anyway, that's the last one for today. So I'm hoping that you picked up some new understanding on some of these universal laws and how you could apply them to your daily life in the kitchen and how you could think more strategically in what you're doing. Think about the chessboard. What's the best possible move in the current situation? Sometimes the best possible move might not be a great move. And sometimes the best possible move is to do nothing. Lao Tzu has a quote, do nothing and leave nothing undone. Anyway, go read the Tao Te Ching. If you want to support the show, You know what to do. Make sure you leave 5 stars, nothing less than 5 stars. It's a 5-star podcast. Hit the like and subscribe button. Go to chefspsa.com where you get all the books and all the merch, including this hat here, Just Cook. If you want extra content, more exclusive podcasts, and you want early access to Bad Cooks Everywhere, go subscribe to my Substack, link in the show notes. And June 8th, go get Bad Cooks Everywhere. You're going to love it. We'll be back next week with a guest. Hit the porno music.
No, it's André in the kitchen, mixing, dropping chef knowledge, no fiction, stirring up the beats, heating up the session. Listen close, class is in session.